What if loneliness isn't a problem to be solved, but a path to be walked? We live in a culture that pathologizes solitude. Loneliness is framed as a personal failing, a signal that something has gone wrong in your life, socially, emotionally, even morally. From childhood, we're taught that being alone means being unwanted, that if no one is around us, it's because we're not worth being around. So we chase connection not for its depth, but for its ability to drown out the silence. We fill every spare moment with noise, notifications, company, anything to avoid sitting quietly with ourselves. But what if all this distraction is precisely what's keeping us from becoming who we truly are? Louise von Franz offered a radical alternative. She didn't see loneliness as a symptom. She saw it as a necessary condition for inner work. In her view, loneliness wasn't the absence of others. It was the presence of the self, undiluted. And it was only in that quiet, often painful stillness that the unconscious could begin its work. You have to be lonely, she wrote, so that the unconscious can become stronger. At first glance, this might sound cruel, even punitive, but what if it's a kind of tough grace? Because the unconscious, the deep, hidden layers of our psyche, doesn't shout. It whispers. It speaks in symbols, in dreams, in strange intuitions, and quiet discomforts. And we can't hear any of it when we're constantly tuned to the volume of the external world. Loneliness strips us bare. It removes the feedback loops of social approval, the daily performances of identity, the constant reinforcement of who we think we're supposed to be. What's left in the silence is raw, unedited, and sometimes deeply uncomfortable. But it's also honest. And it's from that honesty that real transformation begins. We resist loneliness because it threatens the ego's illusion of control. It makes us feel small, vulnerable, exposed. But that exposure is exactly what allows the unconscious to step forward. Not to take over, but to participate. To offer a different kind of guidance. One that doesn't come from logic or strategy, but from something older, deeper, more mysterious. In a world obsessed with visibility, loneliness teaches us how to see. In a culture addicted to connection, it reconnects us to the one relationship we cannot avoid, the one we have with our own soul. So the next time you find yourself alone, not by choice, but by circumstance, pause before rushing to fill the space. What if this isn't a failure? What if it's an invitation? The unconscious is waiting, just beneath the surface, but it will not shout over the noise. It waits for quiet. And in that quiet, it begins to speak. The unconscious isn't a storage bin for forgotten thoughts or repressed memories. It's a living presence, breathing beneath the surface of our waking life. Carl Jung described it as a vast and mysterious realm that holds everything we are but have not yet realized. Louise von Franz went further. She believed the unconscious isn't just reactive or symbolic, but autonomous. It moves with its own intelligence, its own rhythms. It wants something from us, and if we listen, really listen, it begins to speak. But most people never hear it, not because it's silent, but because we're loud. The modern mind is crowded with opinions, headlines, feedback, expectation. We're never not performing, never not watching ourselves be watched. And in this sum, the voice of the unconscious becomes almost impossible to detect. It's not because it's weak, but because it refuses to shout. It's like a wild animal. It only emerges when the forest is quiet. Von Franz saw the unconscious as a second intelligence inside us, not inferior to the ego, just different. While the ego builds walls and makes lists, the unconscious paints dreams and drops strange coincidences into our lives. It's the part of you that already knows the thing your conscious mind hasn't caught up to yet. And it's not there to flatter you. Often, it brings material that's uncomfortable, disruptive, or completely irrational. But growth doesn't come from comfort. It comes from confrontation with what we'd rather not see. To begin any kind of inner work, a relationship with this unconscious is essential. And like all relationships, it starts with listening, real listening, not interpreting everything immediately, not twisting its language into something palatable or poetic, but allowing it to speak in its own terms, through image, through symbol, through silence. Von Franz insisted that this inner dialogue is the foundation of psychological maturity. It's not about self-improvement. It's about integration. It's about making space for a part of you that has always existed but has never been heard. And here's the truth no one wants to hear. You can't do this work in a crowded room. You can't hear the unconscious through applause. You can't feel its presence while scrolling, swiping, posting, reacting. To engage the unconscious is to leave the performance, to sit still long enough for the deeper self to rise. Not because it's trendy or therapeutic, but because without it, you're only half alive. The unconscious waits for us, not to dominate or to judge, but to complete us, and it will wait in silence for as long as it takes. The question is not whether it's speaking. The question is, have you made enough space to listen? When we are finally alone, truly alone, with no distractions, no noise, no one to perform for, something strange begins to happen. At first, there's a kind of silence that feels unnatural, like stepping into a room where someone has just left, and the air still holds their presence. We reach for our phones, for music, for a task. Anything to break the stillness. But if we resist the urge to fill the space, if we let the silence stretch beyond the point of comfort, we begin to feel something else, ourselves. In solitude, the ego starts to lose its grip, not in a dramatic or catastrophic way, but slowly, subtly. Without an audience to impress or a schedule to keep, the ego's favorite distractions begin to fall away. The curated identity, the tight control, the constant search for affirmation. They lose their relevance. What's left is the raw, unfiltered landscape of the psyche. Thoughts you forgot you had, memories that rise without warning, emotions that don't ask for permission. It can feel like being haunted by your own mind. Von Franz understood this terrain intimately. She knew that solitude wasn't just a quiet room, it was a kind of pressure chamber, where everything repressed, neglected, or half seen would rise to the surface. Reflection becomes inevitable, not the kind where you gently ponder your day, but the deeper kind. The kind that confronts you with truths you've been evading for years. In solitude, you don't just remember, you feel. And sometimes, what you feel is deeply uncomfortable. But this discomfort is not a flaw in the process. It is the process. The psyche, like the body, doesn't heal without sensation. And when the distractions are gone, you begin to notice what hurts. And more importantly, why. In contrast, modern life offers a constant escape. Stimulation is everywhere. Screens, schedules, conversations, metrics of approval. We stay busy not because we have to, but because busyness protects us. It insulates us from that strange, honest mirror that solitude provides. We chase connection not out of need, but out of fear, because being alone means meeting ourselves, and we're not always ready for that. But von Franz didn't see solitude as punishment. She saw it as medicine, not the sweet kind, but the bitter kind that actually works. Solitude strips away the ego's distractions, not to punish us, but to reveal something more enduring beneath them. A deeper voice, a more ancient self, something in us that is not shaped by trends or timelines, but by symbols, instincts, and inner truths. And once we've heard that voice, even faintly, the world changes. Not because it becomes easier, but because it becomes real. You can't go back to the performance, not fully, because you've glimpsed what waits behind the curtain. And it's not emptiness. It's everything you've been trying not to feel. There's a moment in deep solitude when the silence turns into something else, something harder. At first, it might feel like sadness or boredom or anxiety, but beneath those labels lies something older and more elusive, the shadow. Jung called it the hidden half of the psyche, the part of ourselves we deny, disown, or are too ashamed to face. And Louise von Franz knew that solitude, if sustained long enough, doesn't just make space for peace or insight. It makes space for the shadow to emerge. Loneliness hurts not simply because we're alone, but because without distraction, the mirror becomes too clear. We begin to see the things we've spent years trying to forget. Envy, pettiness, self-hatred, the roles we've played, the truth we've edited, all the masks we wear so comfortably in public begin to peel away. And what's left is what we've buried. It's easy to be kind when people are watching, easy to be wise when surrounded by applause. But who are we when no one is looking? That's when the shadow appears, not as a monster, but as an honest reflection. Von Franz believed this confrontation was not only necessary, but sacred, because without facing the shadow, there is no real growth. You can't integrate what you won't even acknowledge. And what we refuse to integrate controls us from the dark. It sabotages relationships, distorts our choices, shapes our fears. We project it onto others, blaming them for what we can't accept in ourselves. But in solitude, there's no one else to project onto. The image turns inward. The only one left to confront is you. There are people who've sat in long silence only to remember a cruelty they inflicted years ago, a word they thought was forgotten, but that lives in someone else's bones. Others have faced desires they'd never dare admit out loud. Some find not violence or anger, but grief. Grief for the life they didn't live, the truth they buried to be accepted, the self they exiled to belong. One man, after weeks in silent retreat, broke down, not from loneliness, but from meeting a version of himself he tried to kill with success and status. A woman in extended isolation found herself sketching terrifying images without knowing why, until she realized they were scenes from childhood she had suppressed for decades. These weren't breakdowns. They were breakthroughs. The shadow is not our enemy. It is the part of us that holds our wounds, yes, but also our energy, our vitality, our unlived potential. Von Franz knew that to meet the shadow is to reclaim something essential, something lost, something sacred. But we can't find it in noise. It waits in silence. It waits in solitude. And it waits not to destroy us, but to show us who we truly are when all the lights go out. There is a kind of loneliness that doesn't hollow you out, but burns you clean. Jung called individuation a spiritual journey, not a path toward happiness, but toward wholeness. And Louise von Franz understood something even more precise. This journey demands solitude, not as a preference, but as a crucible. It is in that furnace of aloneness that the fragments of the self are melted down, reshaped, and reforged into something more complete. This isn't a modern idea. Long before psychology gave it a name, ancient traditions recognized the necessity of solitude for transformation. Prophets went into the desert. Monks retreated into cells. Shamans wandered into the forest without food or fire. These weren't acts of escape. They were initiations. In the stillness, something cracked open. Something that couldn't be reached through community or ritual or teaching alone. because there are parts of the soul that only awaken when everything else falls silent. In the noise of ordinary life, the unconscious is a faint murmur beneath the roar of approval, performance, and expectation. But remove the crowd, the titles, the mirror of others' eyes, and suddenly that whisper grows louder. It becomes a presence, and not always a gentle one. Solitude has no interest in politeness. It strips away the layers you didn't know were there, burns off the ego's protective varnish. And in the heat of that inner fire, something is revealed, not invented, not added, but revealed, as if it had been waiting all along. Von Franz believed that this kind of solitude wasn't just useful, it was essential. Without it, we remain fragments of ourselves, driven by what others think we should be, echoing the lives we've been handed. But in the quiet, you begin to hear a different rhythm, not the pulse of the world, but the beat of your own becoming. It's not an easy rhythm. Sometimes it sounds like longing, sometimes grief, but if you stay with it, it becomes something else. Clarity, vision, integration. That same solitude, once feared as emptiness, becomes the ground where creation begins. Bollingen Tower, where von Franz spent long stretches in isolation, wasn't just a retreat. It was a threshold. It was there, in the silence, that she met the unconscious, not as a theory, but as a companion. Her insights didn't come from research, but from listening, from letting the psyche speak in its own language, image, dream, symbol. And she was not alone in this. Artists, poets, mystics, those who touched the deepest truths often did so in solitude. Van Gogh's swirling skies, Rilke's aching lines. Even Jung himself, painting in stone by the lake, spoke of creative acts not as expressions of the ego, but as messages from the depths. In the absence of noise, imagination becomes something sacred, a bridge between the conscious self and the mystery beneath it. The unconscious does not compete with the world's noise. It waits. And when space is finally made, it steps forward, not with answers, but with visions. And in that quiet unfolding, we do not become less human. We become whole. There's a kind of loneliness that doesn't crush the spirit but sets it free. For Marie-Louise von Franz, solitude was never a retreat from life. It was a return to it. At Bollingen, in the quiet stone tower beside the lake, she found not emptiness, but a deepening. It was there, away from the world's rhythms, that the unconscious began to speak in images too subtle, too strange, too sacred to emerge in ordinary conversation. Her insights didn't come from analysis alone, but from surrendering to silence, trusting that what rises in solitude is not chaos, but meaning, waiting to be seen. The world often romanticizes creativity as a sudden flash, a divine spark, but the truth is more demanding. Real creation requires space, vast, quiet space, where the ego loosens its grip and something older can take the reins. Von Franz knew that the unconscious doesn't speak in straight lines. It paints, it dreams, it constructs strange symbols in the corners of your mind and waits for you to notice. And in the noise of everyday life, we rarely do. But in solitude, these strange inner fragments have room to unfold, and from them, something astonishing can be born. History tells the same story again and again. Rainer Maria Rilke withdrew from society to write his most haunting poems, refusing even letters from friends so he wouldn't disturb the fragile connection he had with his inner world. Emily Dickinson lived much of her life in near complete seclusion, turning that silence into poetry that still startles with its intensity. Beethoven composed some of his most transcendent music in isolation, even as he lost his hearing. These were not social accidents. They were sacred decisions. The world could wait. The soul could not. Creativity, at this level, is not about producing. It's about listening, about giving form to what has no form yet. Von Franz's work often reads less like psychology and more like myth-telling, not because she was escaping science, but because she was in touch with the archetypal world from which myth itself emerges. Her ability to interpret dreams, to understand fairy tales as maps of the psyche, didn't come from textbooks. It came from years of walking the terrain of her own inner wilderness. To create in this way is not to decorate the world. It is to reveal it. It is to give voice to the parts of us that language alone cannot reach. And that voice needs stillness. It needs absence. It needs the fertile loneliness that scares us, because it dismantles everything false before allowing anything true to be built. In solitude, the unconscious doesn't just whisper, it imagines. And if you're quiet enough and patient enough, it will hand you something unexpected. Not just a creation, but a revelation. Not just art, but a deeper version of yourself. We are experts at avoiding ourselves. The moment silence creeps in, we reach for distraction like a reflex. A glowing screen, a passing conversation, a to-do list, a drink, a scroll. Anything to keep the stillness at bay. Loneliness, we've been taught, is something to run from, to medicate, to cure. But not all forms of being alone are the same. There is a loneliness that wounds, yes, but there is also a solitude that heals. The tragedy is that we often confuse the two, and in trying to escape one, we throw away the other. Louise von Franz understood this difference with piercing clarity. Isolation, she said, can crush the spirit when it's imposed from the outside, when we are cut off from the world against our will, rejected or forgotten. But solitude is chosen. It's not a punishment, but a discipline. A quiet rebellion against the overstimulation that numbs us to our own depth. And yet, most of us never give ourselves the chance to experience it. Not because we don't have time, but because we've been conditioned to be terrified of what we might find there. Modern life is built on avoidance. Everything is engineered to keep us from pausing, reflecting, feeling too much. The pace is frantic, the noise relentless. We carry a universe of distraction in our pockets, available at the flick of a thumb. We live in a constant feed of information, opinions, validation, and mistake that flood for connection. But behind the flood is a drought, a deep psychic dehydration. The unconscious has no room to breathe in a life lived on the surface. Von Franz warned that the very state required for inner growth, stillness, emptiness, the space where the unconscious begins to rise, is the state we're most often told to avoid. We fear it because it dismantles the narrative we've constructed. It reveals what's underneath the role, the mask, the posture. And that unveiling, though essential, is uncomfortable. But the discomfort isn't the problem, it's the path. The real danger lies in numbing it away. Every moment spent in distraction is a moment borrowed from self-discovery. Every avoidance is a delay, and the longer we delay, the harder it becomes to remember what stillness even feels like. We become strangers to our own depths, experts in performance, amateurs at presence. But growth, real, lasting, inner transformation, doesn't happen by chasing more. It happens by making space for less. To stop running is not to collapse. It is to arrive. To choose solitude is not to disappear, but to finally appear to yourself. The world will not teach you how to do this. In fact, it will quietly punish you for trying. But the unconscious doesn't care about likes or deadlines. It waits beneath the surface, unhurried, undemanding. All it needs is silence and the courage to face it. The unconscious does not shout. It doesn't demand your attention the way the world does. It waits quietly beneath the surface of your daily life, observing, remembering, weaving its stories in symbols and silence. To hear it, you must slow down. You must listen, not with your ears, but with something deeper, something most of us have forgotten how to use. Listening to the unconscious is not about effort. It is about space. And most of us live lives so crowded, there is simply no room left for anything unknown to appear. Louise von Franz believed that the unconscious is always trying to speak to us, but that its language is different from the one we're taught to use. It speaks in dream images, strange moods, sudden insights, and odd, persistent symbols. You won't find it in your calendar or inbox. You find it in the quiet moments, the moments you usually rush to fill. To truly listen, you need a practice. Not a routine of discipline and achievement, but a gentle ritual of invitation. Something that says, I'm here, I'm ready, even if I don't understand you yet. Journaling is one of the oldest doorways. Not the curated writing we show to others, but raw, unedited thought, the kind that spills onto the page before your ego has a chance to tidy it up. In those scattered sentences and half-finished ideas, something strange starts to show up, a pattern, a question, a voice that doesn't sound quite like yours but feels more honest than anything you've said aloud in weeks. Dreams, too, are a kind of message. Von Franz believed they were letters from the unconscious, delivered each night whether we remember them or not. Writing them down, not just analyzing them but honoring them, creates a conversation. And over time, the unconscious begins to speak more clearly, more often. But it won't speak into noise. It won't compete with the constant scroll of distraction. That's why silence matters, not as absence, but as space. A sacred pause where something other than your conscious mind can finally enter the room. Von Franz treated inner work as something almost ceremonial, a candle lit, a walk taken without headphones, a room left quiet long enough for something to arise. These small rituals aren't aesthetic. They're psychological signals. They tell the unconscious it's safe to emerge. And when it does, it brings not just insight, but healing, guidance, meaning. Loneliness, in this view, is not a mistake. It's a threshold. It feels like emptiness at first, but it isn't. It's space being made. And into that space, the unconscious steps forward, not as a problem to be solved, but as a companion to be heard. Listening to it is not always easy, but it is always worth it. Because what waits behind the silence is nothing less than the forgotten half of yourself. There is a moment, often after a long silence, when something shifts. It doesn't arrive with trumpets or certainty, but with a quiet clarity that feels older than you are. After the discomfort, after the dreams, after the ache of loneliness has softened into stillness, something begins to emerge. Not a better version of yourself, not some perfected identity, but a sense of coherence, a knowing, as if all the scattered parts of you had slowly found their way back home. Louise von Franz saw this often in her work. People who came fragmented by noise, by performance, by the weight of roles they no longer believed in. They were anxious, disconnected, sometimes convinced they were broken. But what they needed wasn't more advice or analysis. They needed space. They needed to be still long enough for the unconscious to do its slow, invisible work. And when it did, what emerged wasn't just relief. It was transformation, real psychological rebirth. Not dramatic, not sudden, but unmistakable. A woman haunted by indecision begins to trust her intuition. A man consumed by rage dreams of water, and wakes with something softer in his chest. A person who once feared being alone now defends their solitude as sacred ground. This is the gift of wholeness, and it never arrives from the outside. It isn't built on more connections, more followers, more achievements. Those things may distract us from our emptiness, but they don't fill it. Wholeness comes when we stop outsourcing our worth, when we stop arranging our lives around what will please or impress, and instead begin listening to what is quietly asking to be integrated. The weak parts, the forgotten parts, the ones we thought we had to hide to be loved. The unconscious doesn't want perfection. It wants truth. It wants all of you, not just the image, but the shadow, not just the plan, but the wound. And when you've spent enough time in silence, enough time letting those pieces speak and breathe, you begin to feel it. A sense of inner alignment. The war within starts to quiet. The split between who you are and who you pretend to be begins to close. Von Franz never promised ease. She knew this process would often hurt, but she also knew it was worth it. Because on the other side of loneliness, there is strength. Not the brittle strength of control, but the deep strength of integration. The kind that doesn't need to prove anything. The kind that can stand alone without feeling empty. Wholeness is not a finish line. It's not a reward. It's a return. A remembering of what was never actually missing, only buried beneath noise, fear, and the need to belong. And the great paradox is this: to come home to yourself, you often have to leave everything else behind, just long enough to hear what was calling you all along. There's a strange moment, often late in the process, when solitude begins to feel less like a wall and more like a window. You sit in silence, thinking you've gone inward, thinking this journey is yours alone. And then something shifts. You feel it not as isolation, but as connection. A thread. A pulse. As if your private pain were echoing through something much larger, something ancient, shared. And suddenly, the loneliness that once felt unbearable begins to reveal its hidden truth. You are not the only one here. Louise von Franz understood this paradox better than most. She spent long periods in solitude, walked through her own silences, studied the dreams and sufferings of countless others. And what she discovered was not despair, but a deep coherence. Beneath the personal unconscious, she saw what Jung called the collective, the vast shared psychic foundation from which our symbols and instincts arise. And this, she believed, is what solitude eventually leads us to. Not just the self, but the self as a doorway into the whole. In loneliness, she once said, you meet not just yourself, but the soul of the world. It sounds poetic, but it is not metaphor. It is experience. Anyone who has stayed with their solitude long enough knows this. The personal ache begins to open into something wider, more spacious. Your grief starts to feel less like yours and more like a current moving through all things. The image that appears in your dream feels ancient, like something remembered rather than imagined. And in those moments, the idea of being alone begins to lose its meaning. Because we all carry the unconscious. Every single person, whether they know it or not, whether they listen or not. Beneath every surface, behind the laughter, the scrolling, the small talk, is a quiet longing to be seen, to be whole, to be real. Loneliness feels like exile, but in truth, it's a passage, a right into a deeper belonging, not to a group, not to an ideology, but to the human condition itself. The world teaches us to fear being alone, but what it doesn't say is that in solitude, you join a lineage. The mystics, the exiles, the dreamers, the artists, the ones who chose silence over noise, truth over comfort. You are not the first to walk this path, and you will not be the last. So when the loneliness rises again, as it will, don't rush to escape it. Sit with it. Ask what it's here to show you. And remember, someone else, somewhere else, is doing the same. Listening to their unconscious, holding their questions, making space for what wants to be known. You are alone, yes, but only in the way roots are alone, beneath the surface, reaching in the same direction.